Today is two preachers for the price of one. Stay tuned for Reach Out and Live. Welcome to Reach Out and Live, a program of music, scripture, and sermon brought to you each week by the many viewers and members of First-Plymouth Church, Lincoln, Nebraska. Hi, my name's Jim, minister here at First-Plymouth. Now we're in the great Jacob-Esau cycle in Genesis. The congregation is gathered and we have the Doane University Choir. Let's worship.
So Jacob went up to his father Isaac, who felt him and said, "The voice is Jacob's voice, but the hands are the hands of Esau." He did not recognize him because his hands were hairy like his brother Esau's hands, so he blessed him. He said, "Are you really my son Esau?" He answered, "I am." Then he said, "Bring it to me, that I may eat of my son's game and bless you." So he brought it to him, and he ate, and he brought him wine, and he drank. Then his father Isaac said to him, "Come near and kiss me, my son." So he came near and kissed him, and he smelled the smell of his garments and blessed him and said, "Ah, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed. May God give of you the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let peoples serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blesses you."
There is no better soap opera than the Jacob narrative in Genesis. In fact, I would say that that whole section between Abraham and Joseph is filled with some of the most dramatic and melodramatic interpersonal story ever told. Those ancient writers knew something about the human condition, the ways in which each of us, even at our best, can do things and not do things that can harm the other. Even in relationships that are loving, even in the midst of familiar kinships, there can be decisions made that are rooted in our innate tendency to want things our own way. Our tendency to think that the way that we put the world together is the way to put the world together. And often in the midst of those encounters, there is hurt and there is harm and there is loss. Desmond Tutu in the book of Forgiving tells us that because of that, because all of us as humans find ourselves in that place of hurt, harm, and loss, that there's a need for reconciliation. There's a need to be forgiven, and there's a need to forgive. He tells us that forgiveness is not a point in time, but it's a process, and so we choose whether we enter such a process. Tutu also reminds us to beware, because if we don't choose to enter a process of healing, the opposite is a continual cycle of violence, hurt, and harm to ourselves and to the other. You don't have to watch the news or read the newspaper to know that that happens so often in our world. You hit me, I hit you back. You harm me in this way, I harm you in that way. Nation states do it, individuals do it, communities do it, tribal groups do it. And so we indeed need forgiveness. No wonder Jesus told us that when we pray, we should pray like this. Forgive our debts as we forgive our debtors. And so Tutu reminds us that there's a process that can help us attain a place of reconciliation. And that process begins with telling the story of what has happened, the dignity violation that has taken place, the harm that has come our way. And we need to create spaces where the story can be told, where we can hear each other's stories. But the second step is a more difficult one. It's not just enough to tell the story. We must name the actual harm that's been done. If we have been the ones whose dignity has been violated, we must be clear and crisp and specific about the ways that the action or inaction of the other has hurt, harmed, or cost us loss. If we have been the ones who have been the perpetrators of such dignity violation, then we must be willing to listen attentively to the way our actions or inaction have had a consequence in that other human before us. And there is the difficulty, isn't it? That we so often don't want to hear the reality of the hurt and harm that we cause. We rather, close our ears to it and just move on. In fact, there's a whole language in our culture that says, oh, just move on, just let it go. About 10 years ago, I was pastoring in this congregation that was growing among young adults. And so we decided it was time for a new Sunday school class of young adults. And so we were wondering where to put such a class, and we found a classroom that had been a working classroom about 30 years before, but over time have become a storage closet. Now, listen, folks, this happens in church all the time, classrooms becoming storage closets, and so it have become a storage closet. And so we said we need to prepare this space to receive adults in it. Well, recently, this man at the church had retired. He'd been a petrochemical engineer in town, and he was excited to retire, but felt like he needed some projects. And so he had been volunteering at the church with those projects. And now every congregation has groupies that volunteer often, and you get to know. So he wanted to tackle this classroom. Now, I don't know if you're an engineer or know an engineer, but he was very particular about the way he was going to approach said project. And he gave me a 27-point bullet list of the process through which this project will be managed. And of the 27 points, there were 22 points that I had to care for myself. So I took the list and nodded and said, "Oh, thank you so much for helping us with this project." And he had a timeline. He would return 2.5 weeks from that moment with paint and with primer and with brushes and with cleaning supplies in order to get the classroom ready. Well, it's no surprise that I'm no engineer. I'm a pastor, an armchair theologian. Whereas engineers see things so in specific ways, I see things in much broader ways. Whereas he was very much black and white about certain things, I'm about interpretation and ways of looking at the world. Whereas he was really concerned about the project management, I was just trying to do my hospital calls and my sermon for Sunday. So the 2 weeks passed, and none of the 22 points have been accomplished. But he shows up on schedule 5 minutes before the appointed time with brushes and paint and primer, with drop cloths. And he entered the room expecting the room to be prepared. And it wasn't. At which point, he beelines to my office. And folks, I confess to you that I had totally forgotten about the set appointed time. But at that moment, he was so angry. And he faced me with this reality that I had agreed to these 22 points and that nothing was done and that his time was wasted and his financial resources were wasted. And how dare I agree to something like this and not follow through? I wish I could tell you that your pastor was pastoral. I wish I could tell you your pastor was mature on that day. Instead of me acknowledging the reality that I did not keep up with the 22 points, or better yet, instead of me having been clear with him 2 weeks before that there was no way in the universe that those 22 points could be met, I decided to give him a generic apology. I am so sorry, Joe, for whatever it is that you're angry about. See, Tutu was right. When we don't acknowledge the reality of the hurt, harm, or loss that we have caused, we actually do a further dignity violation. when we don't take seriously the way our actions have certain consequences, we indeed create a larger problem. When we don't face the reality that we're human and that we mess up and that our actions have consequences to that other, we indeed continue a cycle that we do not want to continue. So what do you think his response was on that day? It was a long 24 hours. And the next day, I picked up the phone. I was still angry, and so was he. But in that moment, he did something that surprised me. He said, Pastor Juan Carlos, I shouldn't have yelled at you yesterday. I am so sorry. And it was that moment of dignity affirmation. It was that honest moment of vulnerability and humanity that began a process that took a while, but began a process where forgiveness and reconciliation could find a home. So people of God, I'm wondering, what does it look like for us to create spaces where we can hear one another with love about the ways that our actions or inactions have affected the other? What are the ways that we as a community acknowledge the reality that our behavior at times is not best and can create more problems than solutions? How can we create a space where people feel safe in this community, acknowledging their humanity and the ways in which they too can be part of a problem? How can we a place that creates a seedbed for forgiveness and reconciliation to find its way so that we can indeed say each and every Sunday, forgive our debts like we forgive our debtors? It begins with the tough work of naming harm, the hard work of recognition, the gritty work of the ways we humans can be tough on one another. And once we do that in those large ways, then as Dr. Keck will speak to us in just a second, the smaller moments of forgiveness can happen much more easily. Are we willing to go on the journey together? Are we willing to create space? I think we are. It could be that forgiveness is around the corner.
It struck me like a lightning bolt when I was 13 years old. I suddenly realized I was not entirely moral. I had thought up to that point, I'm a good person. I know this sounds kind of ridiculous, but I thought I've got a totally good heart. I know it even sounds egoistic, but I had no nuance. I thought I'm a good person. Until this happened. Let me tell you of it. I'm 13 years old. I'm home on an afternoon, and my best friend came over, and he was so distraught. He had just struck out in the bottom of the sixth inning with the bases loaded. Now, in a Little League game, the sixth inning is the last inning. And he was so upset. And as he told me about his failure, I felt a tinge of happiness. I remember it like it was yesterday. And I remember how perplexing that was to me. Here's my best friend, and he's so distressed, and I could feel a little rise of pleasure in me. What did that mean? Now, my best friend and I, we competed about everything, right? I mean, everything. In baseball, football, basketball, that was the holy trinity of my generation. We didn't even know what soccer was. I know that's hard to believe. But we competed, he and I. We were always trying to get a leg up on one another. It was constant competition. But I wasn't in that game. And yet something within me still felt some happiness at his failure like maybe it gave me a step up. What is that about? The Germans have a word for this. It's called Schadenfreude. When you feel some pleasure at someone else's misfortune. They have a word for it, Schadenfreude, because it's so ubiquitous. I suppose we imagine in some weird way we're always in competition with one another. And when someone else is having a problem, maybe it makes us look better and Schadenfreude happens. Well, I didn't know the German word when I was 13, and it really confused me. And I'm not exaggerating, I had trouble forgiving myself. It was so distinct, that pleasure I'd felt. And I didn't understand it, and I couldn't really forgive myself. It wasn't until much later that I finally began to hear the wisdom and grace in our tradition. You see, in our tradition, we talk about sin, but the word sin has been so misused by the church, saying certain things are sin and being judged, or calling some things sins that aren't sins, like being gay, or the church has ruined that word. But in the wisdom of our tradition, sin is this self-centeredness that is within all of us, this imperfection. That's what it is. And in Luke 15, our gospel will present you an image of God. It's really the central image in our New Testament in Luke 15. And it's in the story of the prodigal son. Remember, the young son asks for his inheritance from the father. The father is clearly God in this story. The young son gets the inheritance and goes off and just lives immorally and dissolution, and I mean, his life becomes like a dumpster fire. He's like a hot mess, right? He just ruins his life, loses himself. He comes back, and before he can even ask for his father's apology, his father is running out on the road with arms open to forgive him. See, this is our God. It took me a long time to realize I'm forgiven. I've got self-centeredness in me. Sin. But I'm forgiven. This is our God. There's something you're holding on to. I know, because it's ubiquitous. There's something you're holding on to where you didn't measure up, or something you're ashamed of, or there's something. And maybe you haven't heard the truth yet fully for yourself. In our tradition, the truth, God has forgiven you for that long ago. God has forgiven you of that before you even thought to ask forgiveness. You have been totally forgiven. You are totally accepted. And then you're set free to not be such a hard taskmaster on others and be so unforgiving to others when you know that you've received this forgiveness. May we leave this day with hearts more gentle, more ready to forgive. I am so glad we could worship together, and I hope it has made your heart more peaceful. Do you know you could join our worship services live every Sunday morning at 9 and 10:30 on Facebook, YouTube, or our website, and all of this is made possible by friends like you. Hey, and I do need a favor. We're trying to take a survey on how people are accessing our worship life and if it's meaningful to them. You're watching on TV. If you're willing to go to our website and our homepage, there's a survey asking, how are you experiencing our worship? Can we do more for you? Please fill it out.
If you believe that an open-minded, loving congregation can help change the world, then consider making a donation. It will help us increase the love of God and neighbor, both in Nebraska and the world. If you would like to learn more about our church, go to firstplymouth.org. You can watch videos of the sermons, learn about our many programs and missions, then follow us to Facebook and become a friend.
We now worship online at 9 a.m. and 10:30 on YouTube, Facebook, Vimeo, and our website. We also add live events, so join us online. And so remember, my friends, everyone you meet is carrying heavy burdens beyond what you can imagine. And that will open up our compassion and empathy for one another. We will live in forgiveness, and we will reach out and live.
Tune in again next week for another edition of Reach Out and Live.